biological engineering. If you are 34 years or younger and you are an ASABE member, you are automatically part of the young professional community. We have over 1,300 members currently in our community. So every once in a while, you'll see blasts, email blasts from us. If you are not getting those emails, please reach out to us at ypc@asabe.org to make sure that we get you on that list. But you are automatically part of our community. What is our mission? No community is worth anything unless we have a purpose and a goal. And our big goal is to help pre-professionals transfer into being professionals. And so one of the big things that we do is we take young professional issues and we develop those into provided resources that you can use. Like this webinar is one of those that fills a need for looking at where you're at in your career as a young professional. We provide social and networking opportunities. We also look a little bit at, when you're a pre-professional or a student, how do you make that transfer into being a professional? Big thing we do is promote ASAB objectives as well as ASAB membership. And we like to see, and a big project we're working on right now is fostering that YPC community at a local section level, not just on the major ASABE scale. So that's a big project that we're kind of working on right now. We do have some more upcoming YPC events that we want to make you aware of. Of course, today is our Career Spotlight webinar. This is a little bit more for pre-professionals, but we do have a student competition orientation coming up on March 15th. Keep your eyes open if you're interested in basketball. We have a March Madness event coming up, so keep an eye on our social media accounts for information on that. If you're looking into grad school, we have a grad school tips and tricks webinar coming up on April 7th. Registration for that is on the asabe.org events tab. And also keep your eyes peeled if you are looking at taking the PE either in this October or next October and you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. We're going to go into kind of an in-depth PE exam kickoff event, date to be determined, but please keep your eyes open for that. Probably be the end of March or beginning of April. Also keep in mind the annual meeting this year is virtual. That's July 11th through the 14th. And we are looking for is unstable. I hope you can hear me. We have industries that please reach out to us at ypc@asabe.org. Also, if you're into research, you're a grad student, and you want to provide a video about your story in research, that would be great. And it's more of kind of a fluff piece, not really so tech, things like that. And then if you're involved in ag production, we're hoping to have little short videos that people can watch about different areas of ag production. So if you work on a farm or involved in a farming operation of any type or production, please feel free to put together a short video and send that to us. So that concludes my little snippet here. So I'm going to turn this over to Luke Zwilling. Luke Zwilling is an ASABE member in crime, a partner in business.
Yes, thank you, Gail. And yeah, so can you hear me okay? Yes, okay. Wanted to give a little background of where it started from coming from the University of Illinois to starting Aggregable as kind of a little background here, and I'll let Eric do the same for his part. And then once we get past the when starting Aggregable and doing work there and to where we are now, we'll kind of just tag team back and forth on that. But throughout this, anytime you have a question that comes up, please just put it in the chat and Gail will read that to us and we'll answer that. So feel free to ask questions at any time if there's something that we touch on and that you have questions about, or even if something we don't talk about that you're interested in. We'll try to give you an answer that hopefully is helpful. So from that, so I attended University of Illinois in ag engineering started in 2003. So it's been doesn't feel like it, but it's been almost 20 years ago that it started as a student. And I don't know how many people here on the call are students versus in starting out in industry. Gail, do we have an opportunity to do a survey on that or not? I'm not sure, but if we do, that'd be kind of cool to see how many students are on here.
Work on that.
Okay, if not, it's all right. That was more curiosity as we were getting started here. So yeah, so I started at University of Illinois and did soil and water resources in ag engineering. And throughout that part, my summer of my sophomore, junior year, between there, I started an internship with a company called Waterborne Environmental. And that company was an engineering firm that did consulting for major ag chemical companies with helping with the registration and re-registration of pesticides. So it's kind of a mouthful to say, but it's essentially any company that wants to sell a pesticide in the U.S. and as well as globally, there's a similar process for almost every country in the world. To sell a pesticide, you have to have it labeled for what you're allowed to do with that pesticide. And so that label is actually a legal contract when you buy that pesticide of how you will use that and making sure you're using that in the scope of what it's been tested to use. So at Waterborne, we went through the process of what makes sense for legally labeling the pesticide whenever it came up to be used. So in the U.S., it's required every 10 years. That process has to be re-reviewed to make sure that there's new science or new supporting evidence of making sure it's still safe at that point. So that was on the re-registration side, or if there's a new pesticide that's available, testing that. So that, and everything from doing computer modeling to doing field studies of what the fate transport once the chemical's been applied to an agricultural field. Does it leach into the soil? Does it run off? Does it get into surface water? Or is it pretty inactive almost immediately upon application? Is it degraded by solar energy? Or what happens to that chemical once it's applied? So it's all those pieces. So modeling, field studies, all those various aspects. So I did that for it was almost 10 years, counting internship for a couple of years in there. So about 10 years with that company. And in that process, towards the later part of my career there with Waterborne, got into the part where we're doing a lot of big data analytics, and so trying to figure out from a field study what happens is good for a small location, a particular location. But when you want to apply that across the whole country, or like I said, on a global setting, you need to be able to scale up kind of the statistical confidence in what that data means. And so in that process, we'd work with these large data sets that had the weather, the soil, hydrology across the whole US, and merge those data sets together to run various models that shows how the pesticide would perform on various different scenarios. I mean, we usually do like a 30-year simulation of past weather to show how it would perform. And so using those large data sets, me and some other folks at that company said, hey, there's also application of this looking into the future and applying some of this modeling and simulations for the application for farmers to be able to use this on a slightly different approach. I mean, they're not necessarily looking exactly what the fate of a pesticide does in the environment, but how is it going to perform on their field, as well as growing the crop, because and able to model what a pesticide does, you need to also model the growth stage of the crop and how it's moving the water around and the hydrology in the soil and such. So a lot of what we were doing for a large scale for the chemical companies, we said, hey, at a small scale, this could apply for an individual's field and be useful. And we started company Ag Informatics, and that company had kind of its roots in big data and making that data accessible at a small scale for growers. And it was about 2015. We had and I'll let Eric go here, and then we'll kind of talk from where we went forwards past that, where we had Aggregable, and then kind of the web interface and how we interacted with growers from that point. Well, from there, I'll turn it over to Eric and kind of let him do his background information so we get to the same point in time there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Luke. You know, my story starts off very briefly in high school. I was a top 75% of my class. I was just smoking along as a C student there. And then when I got into college, I just picked the major of atmospheric sciences. I actually have no ideas why I did this, but I wanted to study the atmosphere. I thought it was because I was really good at physics and math, which I was actually terrible at. But then when I got into school, there was one event that kind of changed a lot for me, and that was the day my dad dropped me off for school. He's standing there at the door. My mom couldn't come to drop me off; she had to work. And my dad looks at me, and goes, "Hey," he goes, "You're paying for this, so don't screw it up." And then he walked out the door. I'm like, okay, well, I chased him down the hall and gave him a hug, but it changed something about the way I perceived my future career path, and that's why I tell you this story, because on that day, right at the very beginning of my undergrad, I decided that, you know, what I lacked in God-given smarts, I could make up for with work ethic. And I just started busting my butt nonstop just to get the best grades, make and have great relationships with my professors, look for opportunities, and just go and just keep going. And it helps keep your nose clean, and also helps you make sure that you're kind of staying on task and building a network. So anyways, I finished undergrad. I had a great time doing undergrad, and then went on into the University of Illinois for graduate work. When I got to the University of Illinois studying atmospheric sciences, it's kind of a bit of a weird path, but basically I completed a master's degree, completed all my coursework for my PhD. But where my career began was that as I had finished all that coursework, they offered me an opportunity to join the staff and start teaching as a director. So I became this director of undergraduate studies. Well, I immediately assumed a very large class load. And while I was planning on finishing my PhD, I decided that I got really kind of interested in private sector meteorology, which is where we, instead of doing research to forward the science of atmospheric sciences, we were doing it to basically see how businesses are impacted by weather. And it's a great story, and I'm going to tell you this because there's a lesson for you in this. In 2012, after witnessing the drought of 2012, which really just hammered yields across the United States, I met a small company that made water sensors for gardens, and I'm like, why aren't you guys applying this to production agriculture? I think you're missing a real opportunity. And then I looked, and it was almost as though they didn't even think about that. And so I started thinking about it quite a bit. Well, what ended up happening is I started telling everybody that I was going to start a company, even though I didn't start a company. I just kept telling everybody, I'm going to do this. I'm going to start doing, weather forecasting for very financially sensitive institutions to weather things. And what was funny about it was all of a sudden one day my department head gives me a phone call at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, I was in my car on my way to work, and he says, "Why aren't you here yet?" Now, this man for 10 years has never once asked me where I was ever. That's one of the beauties of being a professor at a university. And I'm like, "Why?" He goes, "I got a guy here who's interested in your company." And I go, "My company?" He goes, "Yeah, your company. You need to get in here." And I was so thick-headed, I didn't understand what he was doing. But what happened is this guy from a very large reinsurance company showed up at the University of Illinois saying he wanted someone to do seasonal weather forecasting with respect to hurricanes. And I just jumped all over the opportunity. I walked in there, introduced myself, made up a company name, lied about the whole thing. He says, "Can we get a contract going?" I'm like, "Yeah, let me take care of that." So that day, after I made this proposal to start this company, I had no idea what I was doing. And my boss says, "You need someone to do this with you." And I said, "Are you interested?" He said, "No." He said, "I got too much on my hands here." He goes, "Why don't you meet this guy named Bill Chapman? He's an outstanding programmer. He's been doing this for like 30 years." I called Bill. Bill and I had never met. I literally picked up the phone and said, "Hey, Bill, you don't know me. We both have degrees in atmospheric sciences. Do you want to start a company?" And Bill said, "Yeah, sure." And he showed up in my office 30 minutes later. And this is the most important thing about starting a company. We learned right away that whenever you do this kind of work, you have to do it under the protection of an LLC or any other type of organized business. What do we call it? What do you call it, Luke? When you get an LLC or you become incorporated or you get, like we did at Aggregable, I forget what it's called, but anyways, you got to get a lawyer. And then you have to go through all the paperwork to become an officially registered business. So we did that, came up with the stupidest name possible, Global Weather and Climate Logistics, which if you read out the acronym says GWACL. And so we called ourselves GWACL. We landed a contract, and then we just started going, forecast and weather. Had no experience, but just figured it out. Well, it turns out my work I was doing for my PhD, we then sold to the first company, which means I can no longer use it for my PhD. And along the way, one of my former students who was working for Luke says, "Hey, have you met my boss?" And at the time, he was talking about Chris Harbert, another guy that we started Aggregable with. And I said, "No." He goes, "He could probably use what you guys do." And so I met Chris in 2014 in December. We had a 2-hour phone call, meeting. And at the end of it, I said, "We need to merge the companies." So we went through a merger and acquisition, and all of a sudden we became Aggregable. And the whole way along, the only thing that I learned on this process was, it was really two things. One, don't slow down. Keep pushing the envelope and pay attention to what people say they want. Everybody out there all the time is screaming about problems. The one thing we did when we formed Aggregable, Ag Informatics, and GWACL was we saw those problems and started to come up with a solution. I mean, it wasn't even right the first time, was it, Luke? I mean, we screwed this up 100 times, but you just look for a solution and you start to build it and you start to show people it and you build a network. That's part of number two. The next thing you have to do in your early career is surround yourself with people that are really freaking smart. You want to be the dumbest person in the room all the time. Do you realize that? Because if you're the dumbest person, then you got something to learn from everybody around you all the time. And I was really good at being the dumbest person and asking questions and figuring this out. So all of a sudden, beginning of 2015, we're going through all the paperwork with our lawyers to make something called Aggregable. And we started to build a web platform that just tossed out all of the solutions we were making for the farmers that said they had problems. And what I did for them is I forecast the weather. I was a part of decision support, producing information that a farmer could use to understand how weather is going to impact their business. And we had a few, private clients as well, and some big ones like AB InBev, which maybe you don't know what that is, but that's Anheuser-Busch. We also did a lot of work with the reinsurance company I started with, but Luke and his team, and I think there were 8 of us in total, right, Luke? When we got this going, yep. We had a lot going on with just a bunch of people that were all working on trying to solve these problems. And at that point, Luke, and I want to let you take over here again, but at that point, we started to look for 2 different paths, right? It was one, are we going to build this into a viable company where we produce more, in terms of income than we have to pay out in terms of keeping employees around? Or were we going to look for an exit, which meant that somebody was going to buy us in the hopes that we could retire? Okay. So we started going down that path. And maybe Luke, why don't you kind of tell them about maybe we should tell them a little bit about the legal process of going forward to get a company started. But then after that, kind of what it looked like for us at Aggregable.
Yeah, that's a great segue there. And one part that I remembered as well is something from going from the transition to being with Waterborne and then going to Agri-Informatics and Aggregables. Like one of the hardest parts for my part of my journey was quitting a job when I was fully employed and happily employed and taking a risk into something that may or may not pan out. As far as at that point we had very limited income, definitely not enough to pay salaries. So we were basically working nights and weekends type of things as enough to get by and hope that we could become profitable. And so, yeah, we took a point where we decided that, hey, if we're really going to grow this, we want to make this happen on a timeline that we think is acceptable, which we were looking about a 5-year timeline to be able to go from nothing to have something that was a profitable company, or at that point, be purchased by someone that decided it was a profitable company. That was our timeline. It was 5 years to make something happen. So to do that, we took on some investor capital to help with that faster growth trajectory. So we could have said the 8 of us, we're just going to put our heads down and do this, and we're going to be the only ones that are going to do this. But we made the decision fairly early on that, hey, we needed to hire an additional employees, some experts, and kind of go along with that where Eric was saying, you want to have the smartest people around you. It's not a problem being the dumbest person in the room, because that lifts you up whenever you're with all those other bright people as well. And so, yeah, we made key hires in areas that we weren't experts in necessarily. You know, most of us of the group of 8, I think there was 4 of us that were ag engineers. There was 2 that atmospheric science, as Eric mentioned, and then 1 that was in business, and another person in computers that had a degree from University of Illinois in computer science. And so we knew if we were going to develop a web platform that's going to be very, very code intensive, we're going to need employees that knew how to write code, how to do it well, and do it in a way that was scalable. So we made a lot of key hires, both in atmospheric science and kind of in the programming side of that, but also in the computer science departments as well. And so that helped kind of propel how quick we can move forwards. I'm trying to remember the exact timeline, but we went from those 8, as Eric said, in 2015, was it by about 2017? I think two maybe. Yeah, it was about 2017. We were up to 50 employees. Those numbers sound about right, Eric?
Yeah.
How fast we grew. So we went from 8 to 50 in about 2 years' time, and it was crazy. That growth from looking around, like it seemed like every week a new person would be starting, type of thing. It's like, hey, you start to get to a point when you get to 50 employees, it's like getting hard to keep track of everybody, type of thing. But it's a different point in your company too, once you start hiring additional employees, that you're responsible for someone's livelihood, which was kind of a different point in your life as well.
They knew the risk they were taking on.
Yes, but and a lot of the first people we hired, it was either their first job or they were coming from, for whatever reason, they were unemployed. Their business laid them off or something. But you get to, and that was some of our first hires. It was a little easier. They wanted to take a risk because they weren't coming from any necessarily a full-time paying job. But as we got into it, there were people from well-paid salaries from companies that were coming over to work with us at Aggregable, and it's at that point, it's like the realization of we got 50 people, and the burn rate of how much cash that is for salaries going through every week. I mean, it's one of those things where, I'm trying to remember the expression we'd use at the time. It's like you've got a foot on the gas and the cliff is right ahead of you, but you're just hoping that you don't run off the edge of that cliff before something big happens. You figure out how to build a ramp or whatever, or make the car fly, but you're always, that cliff is always right there at the edge. And really, I mean, when you have a startup and you're taking in investor capital, you want to be as lean as possible, because if you have just excess cash sitting there doing nothing with, well, that's outside investment that you took on too much investment if you did it really in that way, and you gave away part of the company. All. Yeah, so you really want to be right at that borderline is kind of the optimization piece there of making sure that you're.
Let me jump in, because I want to tell everybody, what we ended up doing is we had a group of angel investors, then we did a group 1 or series 1, and then a series B. And so there was really 3 different rounds of investment. Now, if there's a landmine to be sidestepped when you do this, I'm going to tell you 2 things that I made a mistake with respect to the formation of the company and the investment. Number 1, now I have a young family, so this was part of the decision process, but I was a professor at the University of Illinois. I was invested in our company and what we were going to be doing. But to be honest with you, I probably should have jumped ship earlier and just dove right in, because I believed in what we were doing. And while it was high risk, it would have had high reward. And you have to weigh those things constantly. The second thing is that when we continue to take on new investment, every time you take on new investment, what you own of the company becomes diluted. And the dilution can be substantial, which means that you don't ever want in those negotiations with the new investment to be sitting on the sidelines, because they'll dilute you down to nothing. I mean, that's advantageous for them. And it would allow you to make the case for what your worth is in terms of how much you're going to keep of the original, because when it is sold, and I mean, you typically hope for a 10x valuation on the selling. So If you're worth $1 million, you want to be sold for 10 million, and you can do the math. And I think that's about right. Wouldn't you say, Luke?
Yeah.
So when you're doing all these things, I mean, if you're going to go after this and go after it big, you cannot, and I didn't learn this lesson right away, but you cannot let the fear of failure be something that prevents you from being aggressive and trying things. Because you need to remember that through the whole process of doing this, you're learning the whole process of doing this, which is incredibly valuable for the future. And secondly, you're building a skill set that if it fails, you go do it again. And you can piggyback off that and go after it, as hard as you want the second time around. Now, it is true, and Luke and I learned this very quickly, that it is rare for a startup to make it to a successful exit where you get bought like we did. That does what, maybe it happens 1 in 10 times. It's not 9 in 10 times, but you will get feedback through the process of starting your company as to whether or not you're going to get there or not. So it's not as though it's just like you go and on a wing and a prayer hope that you made it. You have a network of people you're talking with. Our investors, they have a vested interest in us selling. That's what they're there to help us do. And as a result, you need to rely on those folks to kind of help, guide, make the right relationships, get you connected with the right people so that you're pitching what you've done to the right groups, and those people are down the road going to be buyers. And your goal through the entire time is to pretend like you're worth 10 times more than you are. You just want to say, no, the value of this is not that, it's 10 times that. And here's the reason why. And you just keep promoting yourself the whole way through.
And that's a good point about the investors. So when you think about what's the right investor, or it's not about how much cash they have or want to give you. I mean, that's ancillary, but it's more about, are they the right partner for you? Because you want, especially that early stage when you're in your seed funding and A rounds of funding, of making sure that they're going to actually have your interest also is important. Similar interest of how you're going to handle the company and move forwards with it, of making sure that, because they're, as Eric said, they're going to help bring on other funding as well. So making sure that they're doing it in a way that jives with your ideas and your other partners' ideas as well. And we were told over and over again, and you've maybe it's the first time you've ever heard this one, but when a investment company is looking at who they're going to work with, it's not so much the idea that they're buying into, it is the group of founders of that company that is more important. And do they believe in what those founders are actually doing, in that team of how they're running the company? Because it's, maybe 10 people have the same idea, but is it the group that can actually execute that? So making sure you have the right partners and the right balance of skill sets there is an important piece too, of making sure that you can deliver on your ideas. I guess at this point, do we want to answer a few questions? I see several coming in. Gail, I don't know, do you want to ask the questions, or do you want us to read them and go forward with those?
Yeah, so I'll just, so Eric kind of answered here Becca's question a little bit, but she wanted to know, did you feel confident that you knew what you were looking for in potential hires when you went from 8 to 50? Or did you kind of learn that as you went through the interview process, what kind of employee you were looking for? What kind of, there are the technical skills, but what kind of the soft skills also were you looking for in those interviews?
That's a good question. It's one of those things. I mean, you're always taking a risk when you hire somebody. And I won't say that,
people.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say we didn't have 100% track record always hiring exactly the right person. There was occasionally a person in there that just wasn't the right fit, and I guess it's a part that's hard. And I know this was I know it wasn't about a year and a half into the company, but realizing that, hey, you're not the right fit, or they're not the right fit for you, and it's like, hey, you need to let that person go, because it's not good for either person to make that continue to work. And it's really hard to make that decision. Just again, you're affecting someone's livelihood of saying, hey, you're no longer going to be employed with us. But you just got to think it's for the better for both parties. If you're not the right fit for each other, they're not using the best of their abilities, and when it's not a good match, you just got to mutually agree that you need to move on. It's just one of those things that happens in life. And there's going to be some hard feelings there, but you hope you can be professional about it and move forward with that. So yeah, there's always going to be a risk where it doesn't work out right, especially as we are growing so fast with that number of employees. But overall, you hire based on a number of things. Skill set of what you're looking for is somewhat important, but also just the soft skills are as well. And there was many times where we'd be hiring for a certain position and someone would come in interviews like, well, you're not the right person for this position that we're looking for, but we love what you're bringing, as a person, your skills, and we'll figure out a position that you'll work for us and make it work. So there's a number of times where that came up where we were hiring for one position, we actually hired someone for something else. So it was more about the personality, how the can-do attitudes and those type of things.
And that says a lot for a company. That's something I've heard recently, that if you see somebody who has an amazing skill set or personality, if they don't fit for this job, find them another job. Because if they're a valuable person that you can see work in your company, snatch them up.
Yeah.
So,
I'll say
okay.
this.
Go ahead.
Oh, can I toss in real quick? So
Yeah.
one of the things that I would say about the interview process, so whether you're already in industry or you're a student or you're thinking about switching jobs, I think the thing that I put it in the chat here, but I'll add to it. Demonstratable skill was everything. In other words, if someone came in and said they could code and they could do this, I'd be like, well, I need to see what show me. I'm not gonna design some coding problem. We're not Apple or Google saying solve this problem. I want to see problems you've already solved. I want to see what you've done in the past to get you to this point. And because we look at that in terms of how we're going to exploit that at the company to take them to the next level, and so they can take us to the next level. That doesn't mean you have to have already arrived. There's training you'll get, on the job, and it'll go forward. But it was really important, I think, for us to see that people were coming in where they were immediately going to be additive to the position. Now, why I bring that up is because should you think about transitioning to a new company, or if you're a student getting ready to start your first job, in that interview process, most important thing that I ever listen for and talk to, it comes down to two things. One, I want to make sure you're not a complete whack job and weirdo. So learn how to have conversations, shake hands, and for the, dress appropriately. You want to do those things. Those soft skills mean everything, because you don't want immediately after an interview that the people that were on the interview just sit around and go, man, that guy was weird, because it overshadows your skill. So keep your cool when you go to these interviews. But the second thing about it is that when I ask you a question about how you think you might handle a future scenario that I'm making up about my company, I actually don't want to hear what you think you're going to do. I want to hear how you've solved a similar problem at school or at your current company that's in the same vein. I'd love to hear, well, when I was at so-and-so company, we designed this system to achieve this goal. It had a 6-month time frame. We finished it in 5 months. That's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear how you think you can immediately come in and shake our boat and get this all fixed. I want to hear what you've done in the past. So those questions that you get asked in interviews always draw on the rich history of your past to answer them. And that way I see that as how you're going to fit into my team to understand what you've done in the past. So just something to think about there. And I did want to get to Brian's question. This is a good one. How do you balance commercial fit and profitability with growth and technology development? And I'll answer this first, Luke, because about the push from the VCs is there. We work on what's called an MVP, right? A minimum viable product. And no, it does not have where you hope you're going to arrive. It doesn't have what you want it to be polished and look like. Because if you sit there and say you're not going to release anything until it is perfection, it'll be 15 years before you release anything, and you're going to be so broke and no one's going to be invested in you. You don't want to do that. So there is a pressure to get a product to be commercially released fast. And then as it's released, you go to version 2 and version 3 and version 4. And yes, the investors do push you along in that regard. But our investors, Luke, I would say for the most part, weren't doing this on like a month-by-month basis. It was kind of an annual checkup, like, hey, are we going to sell this sucker in 5 years? Or are we, are we having issues where our science team is just slowly developing and just stuck in a science rut, not into the product rut? Because you can't sell science. You can sell a science-derived product, right? I don't know. What do you think about that, Luke?
Yeah, for sure. And something I was going to touch on too was with that profitability piece, early on, we had kind of discussions around the freemium model, where you have a web tool that's free, but you go and sell people's data, like Facebook does, or a number of other of these large unicorn startup companies that didn't necessarily have a business model. They just said, we're going to collect data and somebody will think it's valuable. We chose not to go that route, and we sold subscriptions, and the data that people provided was their data, and they owned that data, and they had every right to keeping all that anonymous to that individual user, and making sure that there was nothing that we would be selling individuals' data was not a business model that we wanted to go down. So if you paid a subscription to use the software, that's was kind of the contract with you, as that was your data. And we did get to, at some point, we did some projects with some other companies. Eric mentioned Anheuser-Busch, worked with General Mills, and some of those projects would be, if as a grower, you would get the software for free if you agreed to participate in this project and share some of your data. And so you could decide that I was going to share information, and that was around what General Mills was doing with sustainability. General Mills didn't have a connection to the growers directly. They generally are buying grain from the large grain aggregators of ADM or Cargill or something, so they were buying grain, but they didn't have a direct connection with the growers, and they so much didn't care of what individual growers were doing, but they wanted to know overall from their supply shed of everything they're buying, what's the average kind of sustainability of how this product, the ingredients that go into that product are produced. And so that's where we, on a sustainability aspect at Aggregable, we worked with growers directly, protected their kind of confidentiality, and kept their data unique, their unique kind of PPI data, personal identifiable information, and made sure that was protected. But as a whole, we would aggregate that and say, this is what the whole supply shed of where you're buying this, this wheat or this corn from, and the average of that information. So that was something we would work with growers in some circumstances. I know it's kind of getting a little bit off track, but it went with that profitability piece, and how we showed that there was there was different revenue opportunities. There was, like I said, the freemium, the pay your subscription, kind of a premium model, and then also where it was a third party, in essence, pays for the software, but if you agree to work with that third party, then you can get the software for free.
Oh, so here's a quick question from Noah. How did the product deliverables change throughout the process? And were there any surprises? And then, yes, Eric, I think you should jump into consulting as well.
I think, first of all, the product changed quite a bit. We had like I said, we had an MVP, a minimum viable product. We released a first version of our website, and it had, the ability to go down to the field level and produce a group of statistics and outcomes. And we kept track of certain variables for the individual farmer. Then that evolved with time to include more analysis. It evolved with time to, become a version 2 and then a version 3. And we did a lot of updating to that, including both front end and back end. So the science changed, and then the way we delivered the information changed. That kind of, I forget what they call that, but that kind of product iteration is very common in businesses. You release something and then immediately you're on to version 2 of it. And it's either to freshen up what you started with or to build on what you started with. And you keep, we tried to keep our clientele in the loop of what those changes were and that we were doing them. And we also kept an open line of communication with our clients to ask them, like, give us feedback. Do you like this, not like this? What do you want to see? And we would boil some of those down and take good ideas and run with them. But we also, we had many times where we sat down with panels. So we bring in a group of people, feed them lunch and say, what do you like and don't like? And it was just a way of going through that product iteration process. Yeah, I think the biggest, if there were surprises, I think the thing I was most surprised with in agriculture is what people were willing to pay for the information. I struggled with the freemium versus premium idea, and I I didn't realize that, I guess I didn't realize how much money flowed through a farm in a given year, that to pay for something that was only going to cost, what was it originally, like a quarter an acre? It was 25 cents an acre was our initial price or something like that, on average. And, you never want to get into the place where you give something away for free and then later ask to charge from it. That's the first thing. And secondly, you never want to undervalue the first thing that you do. You want to assign what you think the value is and make people believe that that's what the value of it is. And you'll find that you're probably going to meet right about the right number. What would you say to that, Luke?
Yeah, absolutely. Do not undervalue yourself. Yeah, and that was, I know there's Eric, you noted about the consulting fees, and so both Eric and I both started in consulting before moving to Aggregable, which was more of a products business, and it's definitely a little bit of a change of mentality, but I think it actually is beneficial to think about how consulting works when thinking about moving to the product. Although there's some things that are completely different there, but in consulting, you're selling your time, right? Is essentially what you're selling in consulting. When you move to a product, is you're selling a product and all the time that went into developing that product. So whether you're physically selling, a tractor or software in the case of Aggregable, that product is how you are, making a profit, is by selling that product. Whereas in consulting, it's your time and correctly valuing your time.
Yeah, and that can be challenging to value your time, because you got to remember something about the company that's hiring you as a consultant. They pay no overhead on you. They don't pay your insurance. They don't pay any cost to keep you anywhere. So when you charge, you got to understand something, that you need to set the value at a decent. In fact, this would be kind of fun. In the chat, I would just love to do this for me, please. Okay, in the chat, put in there what you think you should be charging per hour if a company asks you to do consulting work. There's no wrong answer. Just put it in there. I'm curious what you all think those numbers should be, and then we should talk about that in a few minutes there. Okay, we got some numbers that are coming in here. But Luke is right. And there's another side to this as well on the consulting. The other side of this is sometimes you can get set up with what's called a retainer, where the company is going to pay you for a certain number of hours every single month. Whether you work 5 of them or 500 of them, it doesn't matter. That's what they're going to pay you. And you are a bit at their mercy on meeting obligations and needs. So if someone ever asks you to go on a retainer, you shoot for the moon with the prices here, so that you can. So if someone says, no, we need you to work every waking hour in the next 3 weeks, that you feel valued enough to do that. So Luke, we got some numbers coming in here. Let's see. So Gail, 130, Jacob, 120, Brian, 120, Noah, 200, Elizabeth, 100. You guys, you have no idea what your value is. That's way too cheap by a very long shot. Let's see. Now, this was back in 2013, but our first one, we set our consulting fee at $300 an hour. And I was still cheap. We're still cheap at $300 an hour. Most of you should be looking at something between $300 and $500 an hour to do some consulting work, if the project deems it. And so these are the kind of numbers that companies are willing to pay to have you provide insights. Now, remember, the agreed upon price is based upon a deliverable. And the moment you accept that, you have a deliverable, and you'll typically have a number of hours set. So it's like, we'll pay you $300 an hour, but we're going to cap you at 20 hours a month. And so really what they want to do is they want to pay you $5,000 a month to do the work for them. But then you have to tell them, like, well, in this month, what you asked me to do is going to take me 40 hours, not 20. And then you go through that negotiating process. But delivering the deliverable is a huge part of that. But yeah, don't sell yourself cheap here, guys. You're worth more than that for the work that you can provide. Would you agree with me, Luke?
Yeah, and the multiplier of what you're billed at versus what you'll actually receive as income there's a huge discrepancy in there, because all your overhead you have to take out of that, your taxes that your company pay,
taxes,
all those pieces, they add up very quickly. So what you are billing versus what is actually a salary for yourself. There's a huge discrepancy between those two numbers.
And I'll weigh
Yeah,
in here
Luis.
really quick as a fellow consultant, somebody who actually does know my hourly rate. That's what I charge. Is as engineers, you know, we set our hourly rate that work in the consulting field, and we affect other engineers. And I often come across this problem when I, you know, send out my fee to a client and they come back, well, this other engineer can do it for half what you can. Like, well, that's great, but this is what I cost. And so when you do set that price, you know, there is that competitiveness out there. There's that undercutting, depending on where you're at in consulting. But yeah, if you have a product that's worth it, start high and ask your client. And if your client's like, heck no, you know, then you can start negotiating. But I agree.
Yeah, but
As,
Gail,
as engineers, I
show
think we undervalue ourselves.
Yeah, but you can show your value too, Gail. You can like, look, these are the other people I have worked for. I've completed these projects. They're all done on time. This was the deliverable. This is what I charge. Do you want someone to get the job done, or do you want half off? You know what I'm saying? Because people do understand the value, right? You know, when I go to get my roof redone, I'm not going to go call the guy that's got 2 stars out of 5 on the internet just because he's half the bid price. I'm going to pay for what I'm going to get. And these companies do recognize that as well. Anyways, the consulting fees that I mentioned here were just numbers that we chose in our field. Also remember this, in what I do, it is not nearly as large of a field as engineering is. So there's so much less competition in what I do than what you do. I would also tell folks that you would want to get to a position with the research that you do, that one, you're not afraid to present it, and two, that you get opportunities to present your research, be it at conferences, be it to clients, whatever it is. You got to have the ability to present what you do. And part of my job at Nutrien is I speak about 120 conferences a year and meetings all over the country, actually all over the world. Last Tuesday, I started in Saskatchewan, did 6 meetings in Illinois, or not in Illinois, in the United States, and finished the night in Adelaide in Australia. And these people, you know, they'll bring you to speak about your area of expertise so that you can share that knowledge. And when you speak, you have to charge for that as well. So don't be afraid. These people have budgets when they put on conferences. And if they ask you to come speak, then you can charge for that too. Just something to think about there.
And we're running somewhat towards the end of our time here. Something else I want to make sure we kind of wrapped it up with, where we talked about Aggregable. I don't think we've talked about what Eric and I are doing now with Nutrien, as far as kind of closing the whole loop there. So we started Aggregable so then in 2018, it was actually maybe even a little bit late 2017, started talking with a large ag retail company. And they, at the time, the name of the company didn't even exist yet. That they are now called Nutrien Ag Solutions is now the company name, but that happened in January 2018. But started talking with them and how we potentially could be a tool that they could use. And so they had the option of either they could contract with us and use it as a software tool that they could use, or they ultimately decided it was a better fit for them to buy Aggregable and all the intellectual property that Aggregable had and all the employees. So it did 2 things for Nutrien. It gave them all kinds of access to models and a existing running piece of software, as well as the employees that had expertise and knowledge in building these. So we talked about growing from 8 to 50, and that took a couple of years. And Nutrien was at a point in 2018, they were starting their digital organization and building that out. So it quickly allowed them to grow another campus with additional employees. So in summer of 2018, Aggregable was acquired by Nutrien Ag Solutions. I think at that time we had 80 some shareholders of Aggregable. So pretty much every employee had some stock options. We had some outside investors. We had the founders. So a number of people had ownership in Aggregable. And so when we made the exit in 2018, all those people got shares, got the share price for each of the shares that they had. anything else to add to that part of it, Eric, on the kind of the acquisition piece?
No, it was, it was relatively smooth. Nutrien had done this a lot, and we were all onboarded, and kind of took over some new roles. But when a company is courting you, it is important for you, I think, to do some research in what their company culture is, and what they're doing, because sometimes you can get blinded by, wow, I'm going to sell my company and find the exit out of this. I think Nutrien was a smart move for us in that they shared a lot of the same core values as our company did. And then also, make sure that if that ever happens with your company, that you understand the timeline for the, I don't know what you call it, the full merger of technology. I think initially that was a bit rough for us, but we figured it out in the long run, and Nutrien's been a great company to work for. But yeah, it was fun to go from, I went from the university for 13 years, then went to Aggregable, where we had it's a very small number of employees, and Nutrien has 25,000 employees. It's a monstrous company, but it's still been a good ride.
Yeah, no, I have a couple slides that to show Nutrien's presence of locations here. Let's see if it pops up here. So there's roughly we have 800 US locations and over 2,000 globally, and primarily, so US has the 800 of the 2,000, but also Canada, Brazil, Australia. Those are the primary countries that Nutrien Ag Solutions has retail locations. So each of these green dots is a Nutrien branch where we have a number of different things going on there. So we have our digital solutions. So that's what Aggregable became part of the Nutrien's digital solutions. We have application equipment and fertilizer and different crop protection products. So Nutrien not only sells the products, but also the services around those. And Nutrien's kind of unique in this space because not only do they act as a retail distribution, they actually manufacture a lot of the crop protection and the fertilizer as well. So they're end to end from the production of the fertilizer and crop protection all the way to the servicing, selling those products directly to growers.
Great. Any other questions for us?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes left if anybody else has any questions.
Maybe I have a question for you all. Is this what you expected to hear? Does this help anybody?
Well, I definitely appreciate it as somebody who's in the consulting industry and is trying to decide where they go next in their career. Do I buy in to my company that I'm involved in? Do I strike out on my own? Yeah, there's at some point in your career, what's the next step? And so this was helpful for me.
I did see a question from Rebecca in there.
What happens to all the investors when you sell a company?
They get paid. What happens is the investors usually take on, a general rule of thumb is that a big venture capital firm will take on, they'll take on 10 investments in the hope that one of them has a more than a 10x return. And so for our investors, we were one of those companies, I think, that was able to provide that for them. So the VCs that took us on, they had a nice payday. In fact, I joke, Luke, Sarah Ventures was one of our first investors, and they have a big brand new building in downtown Champaign. I'm like, we kind of helped pay for that, but that's great. You need those relationships with those folks in order to accomplish this. But yeah, there's a payout, and it's structured. It's usually over a few years. And it is, I know this may be a silly comment, but it is taxable. It will change your tax bracket a lot when that comes through. Just something to think about. And I'll just be honest with you. If this does happen, if you don't already, you need to have really good financial advisory services. In other words, someone that can, if you have a windfall from a sale of a company, someone that can help make sure that money is, either shielded from inflation or taxes. It's one way or the other. So it's invested in the long term so that it becomes a viable solution for you in the future in terms of your finances. And I'll also say this, when we sold, there are a lot of negotiations and lawyers involved too. So there can be some expense to get it done. But you hope that whole process ends up making your previous 5 years of working, in crazy hours, all worth it and translates into a different career path. Would you agree with that, Luke?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's you put in a number of years and hope to get something out of it, blood, sweat, and tears, so to speak, and hope to get a nice return out of there. And as Eric said, it's actually pretty rare that a startup will go all the way to that point. I mean, it is less than 10%. I can't remember the exact number. It's like 7 or 8%, but it's
but that doesn't mean don't do it, because
exactly. It's definitely one of those things. Even early on, like I said, it was really hard to leave my job and start to do that. But I had no regrets. After making that transition, wherever it was going to end up it was worthwhile process. And yeah, unfortunately, ended up on a good note. But even 3 years into it, I didn't regret making that decision.
Yeah, and just remember, even if the exit strategy is the failure, what you did not fail in is all the time you spent getting to that point. You've built up an enormous amount of skill and a network, and you've now got a whole new perspective. And I'll be honest, it will not. It doesn't mean that there's a failure in your career. It's a redirection. I mean, Luke, if this didn't work, we would have done it again, and we would have gone in a different direction, and it would have been. We wouldn't have. This wasn't a. Oh, I gave it my all, time to go back and and be a barista. We had a plan, and we were going after it aggressively, which was what comes back to the first two things I told you. We were restless. We worked hard. We enjoyed it. We got a kick out of taking on a big problem and screwing it up a million times, but in the end, finding a product that we could deliver. And the second thing was, it was really awesome working with a bunch of people that were way smarter than I was, so that we could all learn from each other and go in a fun direction. So, there's risk. There's always going to be risk. I mean, there's risk with us working at Nutrien now. I don't know what's going to happen, but what you end up figuring out there is that if you have the passion to just pursue it, go after it and put everything in there. And then, you know what? You never leave it empty-handed, never. And you just go on to the next thing. And so I was too anxious when I started, and that was the dumbest thing ever. And no, that I don't get to say that because we went through a successful exit. I'd be saying that right now if it completely failed as well, because it was such an interesting process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Agree with you just got to go with it. It's trust your gut and just go with it.
Well, great. I see a couple thank yous in the chat. So yeah, thank you guys for joining us.